Hi guys! Today lesson it's about specific factors and income distribution. There are four learning objectives for today's lesson, and I hope that by the end of this lesson you should be able to first explain the specific factors model and assumptions underpin the model. Second, discuss the effects of changes in relative prices on the distribution of income and who will gain and lose from these changes. Third, explain the role of trade policy in the modern world of economy. And last, explain how the mobility of labor works in international context. Before we proceed with the first learning objective, we will recap on what we have learned so far, the absolute and comparative advantage model. This recap is important because the specific factors model is built based on some of the assumptions in the comparative advantage model. Now we will see the differences between absolute and comparative advantage model. The key assumption of the absolute advantage model stated that a nation only have an absolute advantage when it able to produce goods cheapest than another nation. Whereas in the comparative advantage model, it emphasizes on the ability of a nation to produce goods which it has lowest opportunity cost. So, it might not the cheapest in terms of absolute cost, but it will be the lowest in terms of opportunity cost. In comparison between both models, the concept of absolute advantage is less effective than comparative advantage. This is because the absolute advantage model only focuses on absolute cost without considering the opportunity cost of production. However, the comparative advantage model helps countries in making decisions what to produce using the available resources in an efficient manner. So, nation will know which goods to be exported and imported as well as how to gain from trade. So, all these are conceptual understanding of the models. Now, we will try to have better understanding through some examples of the model. This table shows two countries, Australia and China, which are not trading with one and another, at least for now. Both countries produce land and cloth with the assumption of fixed resources of labor. Let's say one labor produces 6 kilos of lamb and 1 meter of cloth in Australia, whereas one labor produces 4 kilos of lamb and 3 meters of cloth in China. So the question is, does Australia or China have any advantage? It could be either absolute or comparative advantage. The answer is that both have an absolute and comparative advantage. Let us have a look at Australia first. In terms of absolute advantage, we can see that Australia has the advantage in producing lamb. This is because with the same amount of resources, Australia can produce 6 kilo of lamb, whereas China only can produce 4 kilo of lamb. In terms of comparative advantage, Australia also has the advantage in producing lamb because it only has to give up or let go 1 over 6 meter of cloth in comparison to China, which have to give up more, that is 3 over 4 meter of cloth. Now for China. China has both absolute and comparative advantage in producing cloth. In terms of absolute advantage, China can produce more cloth than Australia when using the same amount of resources. China can produce 3 meters of cloth whereas Australia only produced 1 meter of cloth. And in terms of comparative advantage, China only have to give up 4 over 3 kilos of lamb or 1.33 kilos of lamb in order to produce clothes. However, if Australia wants to produce clothes, the opportunity cost will be higher, which in order to get 1 meter of clothes, Australia have to give up 6 kilo of lamb. So based on this example, we can say that Australia going to specialize in producing lamb, whereas China is going to specialize in producing cloth, and both countries can trade with one and another in order to get the goods that they do not have. Let's see another example using possible production frontier, PPF. We can see from this PPF, it shows that two countries, Cotonia and Pisania, produce two goods, cotton and pizza. If we simply look at the PPF without doing any calculation, we would have said that Pisania is good in producing both goods. This is because PPF for Pisania is on the outward side than the PPF for Cotonia. However, this is wrong. We have to look at the number and do some calculation on the opportunity cost for both goods and both countries. In Pisania, the opportunity cost to produce one cotton is to give up two pizza, whereas the opportunity cost to produce one pizza is to give up half cotton. So, Pisania has the lower opportunity cost in producing pizza. In Cotonia, the opportunity cost to produce one cotton is to give up half pizza, whereas the opportunity cost to produce one pizza is to give up two cotton. So, Cotonia has the lower opportunity cost in producing cotton. Therefore, Pisania should specialize in producing pizza to the maximum amount, that is 50 units of pizza, whereas Cotonia should specialize in producing cotton to the maximum amount, that is 20 units of cotton. So now we assume that Pisania will trade with Cotonia and vice versa. We assume that Pisania export 10 units of pizza and import 10 units of cotton from Cotonia. When we plotted this in the PPF, we can see that the consumption in point D is larger, which outside of the straight line than the initial production. Same goes to Cotonia that export 10 units of cotton and import 10 units of pizza from Pisania. So in the PPF, the consumption as indicated in point B is also larger than the initial production. Overall, both countries benefited and gained from the trade based on the assumptions of Ricardian model. However, the Ricardian model suggests not only that country gain from trade, but also every individual is made better off because trade doesn't affect the distribution of income. This was explained in the previous lesson, which laborers or workers are allowed to move freely to whichever industry that pay higher wages. However, in the real world, trade has effects on the income distribution within each trading nation. So, the benefits of trade are often distributed unevenly instead of equally. Why? There are two main reasons. First, resources cannot move immediately or without cost from one industry to another. Second, industry differ in the factors of production they demand. Let's recall the example of cheese and wine industry. We know that based on the Ricardian model, it explained that laborers can move and switch freely between cheese and wine industry, depending whichever pay higher wages. However, in reality, labor cannot move immediately as they want because the skill required for both industry are different. And whoever quit to work, let's say in the cheese industry, will cause the cheese industry to close down or shut down its operation. So, while trade may benefit a nation or a country as a whole, it often hurts significant groups within the country in short or long run. Here is an example of Japan rice policy which show how international trade influence the distribution of income within a country based on what have been explained moment ago. Japan has a policy to limit import on rice, even though Japan has limited land for rice farming. Logically, when you have limited resources in producing certain goods, it would be better to import rather than produce by yourself. However, this is not the case in Japan, which they have limited land and the cost of their rice also higher than the imported one. Yet the country still limit the quantity of rice being imported to the country. Why? Because the government wants to protect the rice farmer. What will the rice farmer do or works if they are no longer planting paddy rice? It is not easy just to ask them to switch to another job. We can't just simply ask them to become a doctor or teacher because they don't have the skill for any of them. So, in today's lesson, we focus in the short run consequences of trade and income distribution when factors of production cannot move without cost between industry. We will see how the industry switching costs for some factors. Hence, the switch is impossible in the short run when those factors are specific to a particular sector. Now we will begin with the first learning objective. The most important idea of this specific factors model is that it allows trade to affect income distribution, which was not explained in the Ricardian model. There are four assumptions of the model, which are quite similar as the Ricardian model. First, two goods produced in an economy. Here we have clothes and foods as the examples. Second, instead of only one factor of production, now we have three factors of production, which are labor, capital, and land. Third, among these three factors, labor is a mobile factor that can move between industry or sector. Fourth, capital and land are both specific factors which use only in the production of one good. Simply said, capital can be used either for food or clothes, but not for both goods. Same for land. It could be either food or clothes, but it could neither for both production. Now we can summarize based on the four assumptions is that only labor can be used in either cloth or food sector, and each sector has to make decision on which additional specific factor that they will use in producing their goods. Here, we can obviously see that in order to make clothes, we need capital rather than land. Capital can be in terms of sewing machine to make clothes. However, land is required in order to make food, to plant various vegetables. We understand how the specific model works based on the four assumptions, and let's see when it puts into the production possibility frontier. This is the PPF for cloth. Simply said, the more labor employed, the larger the production output. But as a result of diminishing returns, any additional labor will have less output than before. So the curve getting flatter instead of keep rising proportionally. Please remember that the labor must either combine with capital or land in producing goods. As explained previously, labor and capital are used to produce clothes. Therefore, adding one labor to the production process without increasing the amount of capital means each worker has less capital to work on what they have, so the output will be lesser than the previous output. A similar PPF also can be seen for food production because without additional supply of land, additional worker will not be able to increase more output than the previous one. We can combine both cloth and food PPF to see how it shows the use of production factors and the production in an economy. The first PPF, bottom left, indicates the allocation labels for both goods in an economy. The second PPF, top left, indicates the production of food. The third PPF, bottom right, indicates the production of clothes. And the last one, PPF 4, top right, indicates the production of both goods in an economy. We can see that from the first PPF, labor can move either from food sector to clothes sector or vice versa as shown in point 1 to point 3 on line AA. Different points will indicate different amount of labor used either in food or cloth production. So, let's see from either one of these points and we pick point number 2. And we assume that point number 2 moved to point number 1. This movement of labor from point 2 to 1 increased the labor in the food production. Hence, the output of foods also increased. At the same time, the labor used in cloth production decreased, and the output also decreased. Therefore, the supply of food production has increased as indicated in PPF 4. How do we know how much labor to be employed in each sector? In the Ricardian model, it explained that workers will work in sectors that pay higher wage or whichever sector that have higher relative price. And the same assumption also apply in the specific factors model. There are two situations to explain this. First, we assume that an equal proportional change in price for both goods. If the prices of both goods increase by 10%, the labor demand curve also shifts up by 10%. However, the allocation of labor between both sectors and the outputs of the two goods remain unchanged. Why? Because wage rate increases in the same amount for both goods. So, labor just remain employed in the sector that they are currently working. They did not see the point to switch between sectors when both sectors paying the same amount of wage. Therefore, changes in overall price have no real effects. Second situation is when there are changes in relative prices, which in this case means the price of clothes relative to the price of food and vice versa. Assume that the relative price of clothes increased 7%. So, labor moved from the food sector to the clothes sector. Subsequently, the number of labor in cloth production increased. Now, who gains and who loses? The specific factors in the sector whose prices increase will gain, whereas whose relative prices decrease will lose. Using the previous example that the price of clothes increased 7%, so the clothes sector gains whereas the food sector loses. Now we apply the discussion to the international trade context, when to import and export. Using the same example, we know that the economy performs better in cloth production because the output of cloth is bigger than food production. Therefore, the economy will export cloth because more production than consumption and will import food because food production is lesser than consumption. So, when the economy export clothes, the clothes sector will gain and benefit, whereas the food sector will hurt because the domestic food sector has to compete with imported foods. Therefore, trade often produces loser as well as winner. Exporting sector will gain and importing sector will lose most from the trade. Because of this, government has to get involved in order to protect the import competing sectors, such as the Japan rice policy. We will have a specific lesson on these issues later, the political economy. However, for today's lesson, we just have an overview why government has to get involved in trade. Okay, now is the last part for today's lesson, international labor mobility. So far, our lesson today we talk about the mobility of labor from one sector to another sector in the same economy or country. But can labor move freely internationally? The answer will be yes and no. Yes, when international migration is possible, and no, when international migration is restricted. Not every country welcomes foreign workers to work in their country. This is because they also want to protect their domestic worker. However, whenever international migration is allowed, workers will also want to move from the low wage country to the high wage country. To see how international labor mobility works, we keep it simple and assume that two countries produce a single good with labor and immobile factor of land. Since there is only a single good, there will be no reason to trade. However, there will be movement in labor services when workers move in search for higher wages. This figure illustrates the cause and effects of international labor mobility. The two marginal product curves now represent production of the same good but in different countries, instead of the production of two different goods in the same country. And we can see that in point C, home workers earning a lower real wage than foreign workers in point B. And suppose that there is no obstacle to labor migration, then workers in the home country will move to the high wage foreign country until the purchasing power of wages is equal across countries in point A. The area shown in ABC indicated that the foreign output increased as the effects of migration of home country workers to the foreign country. So, that's all for today's lesson and thank you. See you next lesson. Bye bye.